At Arizona State University, we're bringing world-class education from our globally acclaimed faculty to you. Earn your degree from the nation's most innovative university. Online. That's a degree better. Learn more at asuonline.asu.edu.
This episode discusses themes of suicide, autopsy, and crime scene investigation. Listener discretion is advised. This is The Fall Line. We hadn't heard the story of Joseph Smedley, an aspiring biochemist from Indiana, when a podcaster named Stacy Bridavsky contacted us. She worked with Joseph's sister Vivianne for 2 years to tell Joseph's story in a limited series they called A Heavy Weight. Joseph's case wasn't precisely cold, not in the classic sense, because as far as Indiana authorities are concerned, his case is currently closed, resolved. But Joseph's friends and family, and many in Bloomington, Indiana, they disagree. They feel there are still many questions that need to be answered, and so far, they've been unable to access much of the information they'd like to. Although Joseph's case is closed, the file has not been fully released to them, or the experts the family have hired or engaged. That's where Vivianne and Stacy's work began, an examination of Joseph's case, interviews with experts Vivianne and her family consulted in 2015 and since, and an investigation into how and why Joseph Smedley's life ended. According to the Herald Times, on Friday, October 2nd, 2015, the body of 20-year-old Joseph Smedley was recovered from Griffey Lake in Bloomington, Indiana. Joseph had been reported missing that Monday by his sister Vivianne. The Herald Times noted that his roommates told authorities that they'd last seen Joseph at 11:30 p.m. on Sunday evening. His sister Vivianne had awoken that Monday to a strange text message from Joseph. He told her that he was leaving the country and not to contact him. Of course, that didn't make any sense. They'd spoken the day before, and he'd mentioned nothing. In fact, he had plans to pay a bill that Monday morning, after class, a fee on an apartment lease that he'd broken in order to move in with 2 of his fraternity brothers. His sister Vivianne was keeping close track of this process as she'd co-signed on the original apartment. But as Vivianne told us, Joseph didn't show up to pay the bill. When campus police spoke to his roommates, they checked his room and found a note with the same information Vivianne had received via text. Joseph was leaving the country. But he'd signed it Smedley, not Joseph. Vivianne tells us that she found that odd. He never went by his last name. He was estranged from his father at the time. Fast forward to Saturday, October 3rd. Though Joseph Smedley's body had only been discovered a day before, there was a preliminary statement on his cause of death. Per the Herald Times, the county coroner, quote, said in a news release that the cause of death was consistent with drowning. No foul play is suspected pending toxicology tests and reports, end quote. Obviously, that isn't a binding statement. Officials are often called on to issue initial thoughts or impressions in a case before an autopsy is completed or test results are in. What the early news report doesn't mention are a few factors that have haunted Joseph's friends and family since his disappearance and his discovery in Griffey Lake. According to his sister, Joseph, who was a lean, light-framed young man, was wearing a backpack weighed down with approximately 66 pounds of rocks or bricks. There was also a pill bottle inside that backpack that was, per the podcast, an amphetamine prescription. The pills were not prescribed to Joseph. When his tox screen came back, there were no amphetamines in his system. According to the podcast, Joseph's book bag was secured to his body with a cord or rope, and Joseph's sister Vivianne has received paperwork that mentions his book bag being worn both on Joseph's front, so backward, and more traditionally, across his shoulders. By December of 2015, multiple local Indiana news sources reported the same thing, that Joseph's death had been ruled a suicide by drowning. His case was closed. But for Joseph's sister Vivianne and other friends and family members, the case was far from over. Joseph, a native of Indianapolis, had come to Bloomington to study at Indiana University. He was interested in biochemistry and pharmacology. He told his family that, eventually, he wanted to develop life-saving drugs to treat terminal illnesses. In fall of 2015, Joseph was in his second year of school. In the spring of his freshman year, he had rushed to frat, Sigma Pi, and been accepted as a brother. Living in the frat house was expensive, and Joseph was paying his own way through school. But he was expected to live with his fraternity brothers. That's why, in the fall of 2015, he decided to move into an apartment with 2 other Sigma Pi's. As far as Vivianne knew, things were going well for her little brother. He'd had a few hard years when they were teenagers. Vivianne recalled that after their parents' divorce, he'd spent time living with their mother in the Virgin Islands, had issues with their father, and eventually became an emancipated minor. Then Joseph spent time at the end of high school living with family friends and made it into Indiana University all on his own. Vivianne was also living and working on her own at the time of Joseph's death. She was attending school and was married to her first husband and was in the process of buying a house. Though she lived an hour away in Indianapolis, she and Joseph spoke often, and they were in very frequent contact the final weekend of September 2015 when Joseph disappeared. That's when he promised he'd take care of that outstanding apartment bill for Vivianne. When his room was checked by campus security and later by family, it was clear that he'd picked up his paychecks that he was planning on cashing to use for that apartment fee, but he never made it there to pay the bill. The last sign anyone had from Joseph was that strange text that Vivianne received at around 4 a.m. on Monday morning, telling her that he was leaving the country. Strangely, Joseph's phone didn't send a text to their younger sister, to whom he was also close, or to anyone else, just to Vivianne, whom he'd been speaking to all day. Vivianne does not believe that her brother committed suicide. Neither does their father, Joe, who was contacted about his son's case soon after Joseph's disappearance became known. Though he and Joseph were estranged at the time of Joseph's death, Joe was treated as the point of contact by various law enforcement agencies involved. At the time of Joseph's death, Joe was actually married to a law enforcement officer, though not one local to the area, and she advised Joe on Joseph's case. Vivianne sought out help too, from an attorney, from a pathologist who could perform a second autopsy, and eventually from podcasters. She also recorded almost every conversation she had, right from the beginning, the ones that she could at least, to keep a record of Joseph's case. She felt something was wrong right from the start. Not just that her brother was missing that first week, but that almost no one in town knew. To her knowledge, there was no all-campus alert reporting his disappearance. Years later, when Vivianne met Stacy and began work on what would become their podcast, that tape came in handy. All of her work did. Combined with Stacy's research, they began to piece together an investigation into Joseph's last days, leading up to his disappearance and his discovery in the lake, weighted down with close to half his body weight in stone, and what came after. We spoke with Stacy and Vivianne about Joseph, their work on his case, and where everything stands today. Stacy and her husband own a recording studio, which was key in the ability to produce a heavy weight. First, Stacy and Vivianne talked to us about how they met and how Stacy became aware of Joseph's case.
I had just heard about Joseph's story, really living in town. I moved here in 2015, and it was one of the first news stories that just really caught my attention. And then I didn't hear too much more about the case, looked it up a few years later, and then it really kind of stuck in my mind again around like 2018, 2019. I was looking into it, seeing what I could find. I couldn't find that much. All I could find was that the case was closed, which I thought that is just even more strange, given the details that were released through the news. And living in a college town, just hearing other missing students that come from time to time, this case was so much different. So I just started doing kind of my own little investigation into what I could find and reached out to Vivianne. And we decided to meet up, just have a drink and chat and talk over the case. And we just really hit it off. And I felt like, okay, there's something that I can do here to help this. And then at that time, she was working with another podcast group, Cold Case Chronicles. And so I was kind of waiting to see like what's going to come with that, not to saturate too much at once with the story. Like I thought, let's see what happens with that podcast, see if it gets some national attention. I thought they did a great job. For whatever reason, Joseph's case has been hard to like break through into more national media. So when that still didn't happen, I was like, hey, let's just do a podcast ourselves. We have a recording studio. I have great like media contacts. So there's something that I can do, but I didn't know what it would look like, never having done a project like this. And I mean, it's been probably 2.5 years really that the full project has come together.
Yeah, I like meeting Stacy out in Bloomington one day, and we just kind of talked and went through the story together. And she had told me kind of how her passion was to find out more information. And so I was super, super grateful for how much she's been able to do for this case.
So I know that you had immediate concerns regarding Joseph that sort of led you to request a welfare check. I was hoping you could talk to us about that briefly and how you feel his missing persons case was treated after it was clear that he was not on campus.
Yeah, so Joseph was moving out of his current apartment and wanted to live with two of his fraternity brothers kind of around the corner from the fraternity house in like a rental off-campus home. And so after he did that, I guess he misunderstood the process, and he thought that the apartments was going to cover like finding another person to take his place. And so after he moved, they had reached out to him and said, no, you actually broke your lease, so this is how much you owe us. Well, I had also signed like something called a guarantor form, and at the time I didn't really know what it was. I was like 22 at the time. So I was just trying to help him out. He said that that was the only way he could live there. So I filled it out. Well, it turned out to be a cosign agreement, basically. So they reached out to me and said that I was responsible for all of that remaining balance if Joseph wasn't going to be able to provide it. So I basically was following up with him the entire week leading up to him disappearing, because we were trying to figure out ways of how he was going to do that. I was actually applying for a home at the time, so it was really, really important for me to not have that on my credit. So we were just kind of going through, like, okay, how are you going to get the money? Is it possible for you to get the money? He said yes. So then, we just talked every day. And then by that weekend, the night that he actually disappeared, that Sunday night, I called him again and said, hey, deadline's tomorrow. It's at noon. Are you going to be able to, drop off the check? He said yes. I guess he was waiting on like payment from like the painters or something that he worked for on campus. So he picked that up. The check was on, he told me the check was on his desk, and that he was going to drop it off the next day. And so then when the next day came around and I woke up, I had the text message from his phone that had, at 4 a.m. saying that he, is going to be leaving the country. Can't tell me why, wants for protection. And I was just really confused because I just talked to him and, I asked him what he was doing too. He said he was studying. I don't really know what happened between, the end of that conversation, which is probably around like 7 or 8 in the evening to, now he's leaving the country and don't attempt to contact me. But after that, and then reaching out to the police, I feel like they could have done a much better job of alerting the campus. I feel like it could have been, at least if it was a bigger deal on campus, maybe that could have caused a little bit more anxiety in whoever was a part of it. There was no announcement. And I actually met with the Black Student Union about a year after this, and they were telling me this account of what was going on campus. They said that no one had heard anything. Like, even though he was reported missing on that Monday evening, they didn't actually mention Joseph until I believe they found him, until his body was found on Friday. So there's a whole week that went by where he was missing and no notification. Yet when I'm on campus at IUPUI, they're, constantly inundating us with messages about gas leaks, water leaks, someone getting assaulted, someone getting robbed. It's like every time there's a police report, you hear about it. But now there's a missing student and you don't even communicate that. Like, that's what's so strange, especially when he was officially reported missing. So that's kind of the experience with that.
And I would add to that, the university puts out a daily crime log in Bloomington. So that has literally everything that has happened that's of note. So it's just seems so unusual that they weren't immediately using that campus alert system. And usually like BPD would cooperate with that, the Bloomington Police Department. So it would be kind of like if there's a big situation in town, everybody knows about it. Everybody's talking about it. So that's a big thing that stood out to me. And I've requested from the university those records to see if they even listed his disappearance in kind of their daily reporting. And they've never been able to give me any information. And the backlog that they have on their website doesn't go back far enough for me to see. So it's never been clear to me where this discrepancy came from, because it just is highly unusual.
When I first had filed Joseph as a missing person and I was working with a police department, it was IU Police Department. So they were very responsive. I felt like they did a pretty decent job, at least, of communicating with me and letting me know what they were doing throughout the process of him being missing. Once the jurisdictions changed and his body was found, Bloomington Police Department, they had reached out to me and then asked for our father's number. At the time, neither one of us had spoken to him in about 4 or 5 years. So I had, told them that I would be the main point of contact. I was the main person who, filed the missing. But they had insisted that since Joe was the next of kin, that they wanted to communicate with him. So at that point, they pretty much things shifted and they shut me out of the case. And so the only way that I could really communicate with them was through Joe. And then Joe kind of had his own investigation that he did as well. And then I actually ended up getting a power of attorney from my mother, who lives in the Virgin Islands. And so she was able to kind of help me, at least initially, get more communication through Bloomington Police Department. But even with bringing up that power of attorney to them, I had tried to I obtained some of his evidence, his physical evidences that they had in their locker there, and they wouldn't allow me to obtain those items with the power of attorney from her. They said that Joe would still need to be present. So we actually ended up coming back together last year or the year before, and we were able to get the items finally that we needed. And then from Joe's experience, they weren't actually very helpful with him either. He had a list of questions that he had, spoken with a specialist about as well, submitted it to them. They answered probably a third of them. So they weren't really getting anywhere with them either. The university police department pretty much gave me all the information. It was just when things transitioned to Bloomington Police Department that they basically said it was against their policy to release any documents. And so after I'd gotten like the forensic pathologist to perform the second autopsy, he reached out, Dr. Tomasozio reached out to the Bloomington Police Department and requested the documents again. And they again said, we cannot, it's against our policy. And he said, I'm not going to be sharing any of this with the family or with the public.
And then the FBI investigation, I think that people hear that and they think, oh, wow, the FBI investigated. But what that investigation consists of is really just the FBI either faxing or calling BPD and saying, do you have a record of this person? And then them saying, oh, yeah, he was stopped for a traffic violation. There's no really parameters to know that it was a comprehensive investigation on their end in any way. It seems more like almost like a bureaucratic, like, hey, we checked in with them. They said they didn't have really anything, and we leave it at that. Like it's just either phone calls or emails back and forth and very limited.
The autopsy took what seemed like forever to actually produce the report. And so there was kind of this really long waiting game because I also wanted to have a second autopsy done, but I couldn't actually get that performed until the first autopsy was complete. So we basically had to have Joseph in refrigeration for, I think it was like 2 or 3 months. So it took a really, really long time, like way longer than, I'm not sure how long it usually takes to produce a report, but that was just kind of like sitting on pins and needles. And then finally, once the report came out, Joe had received a copy and he shared that with me. And we basically were able to move forward from there and immediately get Dr. Tomasozio to perform on Joseph. He was able to find some hemorrhaging on his back, which he's not sure where that comes from. And again, that's why a lot of that circumstantial evidence is needed, especially like the way that Joseph's backpack was tied. It says that it's strapped to his chest. So does that mean it's, the front of it strapped to his chest, or the back of it is on his back and then the front is tied in the front? So it's just like that, those kind of details were a lot of things that he needed in order to complete the autopsy.
According to Vivianne's understanding, their father received advice to cremate Joseph, and because of that, they've been unable to take advantage of the offers they've received for pro bono exhumations and further autopsy exams. Vivianne tells us that cremation has traditionally not been the norm in their family. You mentioned that you were already planning for a second autopsy during the first autopsy. Would you mind talking about that and what you were thinking?
I had a Indianapolis Police Department detective and a prosecutor for Indy as well. And so they kind of gave me a ton of advice throughout the process. And they were pretty much with me from, canvassing the campus through everything. So that had a lot to do with it too, just having like a team of people that I could rely on that were giving me really good advice throughout the process. I found Dr. Tomasozio, and he is based in Indianapolis.
When your pathologist reached out to try and get the records of the first autopsy and that request was denied, was his case still open at that time?
It's really hard to know because I don't actually know when they officially closed it. When we were trying to initially get Joseph's items from them, they would say that the case was closed, but then they wouldn't allow us to take the information. And I think it was like once the autopsy came out and it was ruled a suicide that they were no longer investigating, but I'm not sure because even after then, it seemed like there were things that they were holding close to the chest.
Were there any other questions that you were left with after the second private autopsy was completed?
They just didn't treat it as a homicide from the beginning. And you'd think that like you just have these standard procedures in place, and then if it isn't what it is, then that's fine. But for whatever reason, like his clothes came in the body bag with him. So like they didn't put that into evidence. They didn't actually do anything that seemed like a systematic approach to, okay, there's a body that you found in the water. We don't know what it could be. Let's at least treat it like a crime and get the evidence that you need.
Just to clarify there, it's not that Vivianne felt that the medico-legal officers would have had to rule homicide to have properly done their jobs. She just worried that, without the assumption that Joseph's death could have been a possible crime scene, vital information may have been missed. She wonders, for instance, what would have indicated suicide versus undetermined versus homicide. We discussed the second autopsy, which the family requested, and the information the pathologist wished he had. What did your pathologist feel like he needed to see to make a better determination that he wasn't able to access?
He wanted to know like how the position of his body was, and he wanted to know, the temperature of the water, or like how was he facing up when they found him, or was he face down? Like all of those circumstantial items matter in a water investigation because there's not a lot of other ways to determine like what happened. So it's all based off of like the circumstantial evidence and all of that. So he just, that all those notes that they made, and did they take pictures? Like now I'm at the point where, okay, maybe we've been fighting them, but they never actually did any of that to begin with. And they don't have it. Like, I don't know.
We have discussed FOIA and release of documents quite a lot on this podcast. Generally, when a case is closed, one can get those files released, but that isn't always the case, and photos generally are not included in a release, though they may be released to experts. Stacy explained what she found out about Indiana law.
I consulted with a couple of lawyers, and the way they explained it to me was just Indiana has this real legal gray area where they are not obliged to release anything. And it can be department by department. And so it's just much harder to get the information than in other places. But I wanted to add one quick thing to what Vivianne was saying earlier, because I think the point that she's making is so important. And what I learned during this process was that if you have a drowning, that can only be determined by excluding everything else. So when she's talking about, hey, where was this systematic approach to eliminate all these other options? To me, that is one of the most important questions in the case, because we don't have the answers for that, because it wasn't treated as anything but a suicide by drowning from the beginning. Which I think, what I learned from Dr. Wolf and Andrea Zafaris, the two experts we consulted with, was that that's kind of backwards. Like you end up with that when you've eliminated literally everything else that you can. And then to even have a death by suicide now, I've learned from them is even harder to determine, because you have to get at the mental patterns that were going on within someone's head. How can we know that if Vivianne wasn't interviewed, if Joseph's father wasn't interviewed, if his best friends weren't interviewed? So how can we arrive at that determination without seeing that this field work was done ahead of time?
I would love to talk a little bit more about how a drowning expert became involved in Joseph's case, because my understanding is that actually, Vivianne, your family spoke to her before the podcast, right? And then she continued on and interviewed with the podcast and added a lot of really, to me, important information. I know there were some things that she really wished that she had access to as well, because she said that drowning cases are one of the hardest things to determine and to look at. What were some things that she wished that she knew that would have been really helpful for her to have access to that she didn't have access to?
So one of the things that she really, well, and let me just preface this by saying Andrea is just really nationally renowned, and she's worked with hundreds of police departments across the country, consulted on thousands of cases. And she actually has even started her own nonprofit that's really devoted to this work, to be kind of this interface and liaison between police departments, victims' families, specific to drowning cases. So it's, she just is this wealth of knowledge. One thing that she really needed were the crime scene photos. She couldn't even make some of the typical determinations that she would want to know, whether the backpack was on the front or the back, but specifically photographs of Joseph's eyes, because there is a way to tell, depending on the quality of the photographs and the other information, whether or not somebody was deceased before they entered the water. And part of her expertise, she noted in conversation with me, that a lot of times there are elaborate setups in cases where the person has already been deceased before they ever enter the water. And so that's kind of one of the first steps that she tries to determine. How can we know which it was? And we don't have enough information in Joseph's case to know without seeing those crime scene photos. And she suspected that there would be multiple sets of crime scene photos, that there should be crime scene photos potentially from IUPD, who answered the call initially and were handling the case initially, crime scene photos from Bloomington Police Department, who then arrived on the scene, and then crime scene and dive photos from the dive team, and then also potentially the coroner's office or whoever arrived from their team.
In the next section, you'll hear mention of Joseph being under the influence. His tox screen came back positive for alcohol and marijuana. The marijuana was likely from habitual use and not acute intoxication.
So there could be multiple sets of photographs that we'd be looking at, and she'd really want to get her hands on those. And then also the knot, I know, is a big question because we don't know if he could have tied the knot himself, if he was under the influence. Is that a reasonable assumption that somebody could have done that? That's a big question that she had. But I mean, she asked questions about the whole case. I remember one question she asked me was, hey, has that note that his roommates found, has that note been fingerprinted? And that's one of the questions that I always circle back to. So she really dives into the circumstantial evidence as well and trying to figure out what the determination could be. And she even encouraged me to do some tests, which I did carry out some based on the flow of the water to see, could his body have moved? Was he likely in the same place that whole time? How deep or how shallow is the water? Because we had conflicting reports even about that. There are reports where it says 3 to 4 feet, 6 to 8 feet, 8 to 10 feet. And all those differences really change the variables of Joseph's case. So without knowing them, it's just hard to know the details. But she did provide, when she consulted on the case in 2015 pro bono, she provided a list of questions to ask law enforcement. Because of the autopsy report, the second autopsy, the private one, with those hematomas, they were bilateral. So the left and the right side of Joseph's lower back. And that was a point that Andrea, the drowning expert, really kept coming back to. If the backpack was not on his back, there's just literally no way to account for that type of bruising. So that is a really important question in the case, because I have several reports where it says the backpack is strapped to his front, which then where could those bruises have come from?
And some reports said that he had it on his back and it was then secured with a cord or rope, right? Versus some saying that he was wearing it on his front with it being secured with a cord or rope on the back.
Correct. Yes.
Vivianne, you recorded almost all your interactions with people from the very start. Can you talk about your foresight there and how did it help in the podcast?
Yeah, so the person that I was with at the time actually suggested it, and I think that was a super great plan. It was just kind of when we first went in to meet with his roommates, just because, when you're going through all this, honestly, like it was like having tunnel vision the whole time. So it was just nice to be able to have something to refer back to. And so when we initially did it, we walked into the house where Joseph was with his roommates, his 2 other roommates, and kind of sat down with them. And there was another girl present there as well, who was with them before he disappeared. And so we had kind of just asked for their account of the story. And I think that having those recordings, even now, is super helpful because every time I go back and I listen to it, there's something new that pops up or there's a new question that I have. And I also just think that it's a really great way to also compare what their statement was with police versus what they were telling me. So yeah, that's just kind of what I was thinking with that whole recording.
So I have a question for both of you, actually.
As you were doing all this research on the ground and going through Vivian's tape, and I know that Vivian, you had already done so much work on the case, and Stacy, you were coming to the case doing FOIA, doing research. With all this information, did you two sit down and plan out the episodes ahead of time? Or did the show kind of come together organically as you were working? Did you know you were going to have this set number of episodes, or did it develop as you were making them?
Uh, Kind of developed as I think like we initially, when we first met, I think Stacy was just trying to get all the information that she could, and wasn't sure what we were going to kind of where we're going to go from there yet. I know that she definitely wanted to do the podcast as well. So I mean, on my end, we didn't like plan every episode. It was more so of like she was gathering her information, and then I would answer majority of the questions that she had. And it was at different times. So like I would come to the studio, or she came to my house once. And so we just had different phases throughout where we just kind of, she'd have a batch of questions, we'd sit down, we'd get it recorded, and then, she'd go and do some more investigating, and then, maybe circle back, ask a couple more questions, dig a little bit deeper into some of the previous questions. And then kind of from there, Stacy could speak more to kind of how she developed the rest of that.
Yeah, I think you really nailed it though, because there wasn't a real concrete plan going into this other than to get the story out there. And I really was trying to be most committed to what I could factually know. So that took a lot longer than I thought it would to really get down to the bones of some of the specifics in Joseph's case. So it was just really this kind of extended time, I want to say a year and a half probably, of going back and forth, me gathering information, researching, talking to anyone who I could get to talk to me. And then it all just really came together in a pretty short amount of time. I want to say maybe 4 to 6 months once I had gathered all the information I could get my hands on.
So I want to ask a couple questions about the reactions to the podcast and what the podcast has done. First, I know that some of Joseph's friends and loved ones participated in the podcast, and I'm sure that a lot of people who knew Joseph have listened to it. What has their reaction been?
Definitely, I'd say like everyone thought that the podcast was super, super thorough. And I myself was surprised. There were things in there that, like, there were people that I hadn't spoken to that had different accounts. And then just hearing all of the different specialists, I think was really, really compelling. And so I really, really appreciate everything that Stacy's done, because I think that, I have done other podcasts, and even those podcasts have had multiple episodes, but I really think that she took the time to really just dive into the details to get everything as accurate as possible. And even just like communicating with me through it with different information, I thought that was great as well. And I think a lot of Joseph's friends and family were super excited about it. Like, I got a call from the Bachmans, who is with who Joseph stayed with pretty much the end of his couple of years in high school. And they were really impressed with it. They thought that Stacy did an amazing job narrating as well, and just the way that the story came together and all the bits and pieces. Everyone's been super happy with it.
I just had one really big hope with the series that has not yet happened, but I still hope that it does, which is that it just reaches somebody's ears who knows something more about Joseph's story, because I know that that person or multiple people are still around somewhere, either in town or whether they may have moved or not. And I'm just really hopeful that if anyone listening does know anything, that they do find it within themselves to come forward with any detail, because even a small detail in a case like this could really change things and help the case to be reopened.
That was my next question. This is a podcast with multiple purposes, right? It's an investigative podcast, but there's also layers of calls to action here. And I'd love for you guys to talk about those calls to action, because we're talking about a closed case that you'd like to see reopened. So I'd love to talk about any movement that you'd seen in the case, and what your calls to action are. Obviously, one is for people to come forward with any information. What else would you like to see happen?
Definitely Bloomington Police Department taking a deeper look than they did initially. I think that, I know that it takes a lot of time, a lot of resources, and if they are not willing to do that, then at least cooperating with us to their fullest extent and offering us the ability to have access to my brother's information. Like, it's just, I think that that's really the biggest thing right now, is they're just more standing in the way than offering a way for us to move forward. And I'm not really sure why the reason of that is, because you would think that, okay, if you don't want to take the time to investigate, that's great. You could hand everything over and we'll spend our time and resources doing it. But for whatever reason, they just aren't cooperating. So that's that. And so we also have a petition as well that has over 120,000 signatures so far. So that's another call to action. It's just at least showing that there's that many people that still have questions, and that many people that believe that Joseph deserves more attention and time than what was initially offered.
And I would add to that in July of 2021, there was a new law passed in Indiana, and that allows for victims' families to petition to have a case reopened, which we are working on. And how that would work is we send information over to the Indiana State Police. We have to notify Bloomington Police Department, hey, we really want this case reopened. We're sending this information on. That's what we're working on right now. And then the Indiana State Police can decide if there is enough information to warrant a reinvestigation. And I always like to make it clear in Joseph's case that this was never a criminal case of any kind. So it was only a death investigation. So there is no criminal case to be reopened. It would be basically like a new investigation, looking at it in a different light. And we're really hopeful, given the experts we brought in for the podcast and some more coverage of the case, that they'll be compelled to reinvestigate this case. That's my number one goal. And I think that it's possible, and I think it's possible in the near future. So we're hoping to have an answer for that, maybe even in the next couple of months. And I think there are some avenues within the case that could be pursued. I know that Touch DNA has made a lot of advances. So if they have held on to some of the circumstantial pieces in Joseph's case, the note that his roommates found, any physical evidence, we could have those things tested for DNA, even though they were submerged in water. There's still a chance that there could be DNA present from somebody else. Or, for example, with the note his roommates found, if Joseph's fingerprints aren't on that paper, then that's information to have as well. So those are kind of the questions that I really mull over, that I would love to see reinvestigated or just investigated, because I don't know if they've ever been looked into at this point. So part of the podcast too has just been bringing more awareness to our South Central Indiana and saying, hey, this happened right here. And if you're living in this area, this is something that you should care about, because it's been hard to get anyone to even speak about his case. Years later, we still have people in town who don't even know that Joseph went missing. So there's just this huge discrepancy. And I know that that climate is present in a lot of cities throughout the US. And I think, unfortunately, is pervasive a lot in the Midwest and isn't often talked about. So sometimes I feel like that's at the root of why no one is willing to talk about his case very freely, because it brings up so many other things alongside it.
Vivianne talked to us about being thrust into the spotlight and becoming a family member advocate, and what she's learned.
The first thing that I think of when presenting your brother's case to the media in a podcast form is the exposure that you yourself are getting. You're sort of putting yourself out there. You're putting your family circumstances out there, especially in the case of maybe an estrangement from different parts of your family. It can be a lot. So can you recall your thoughts as you contemplated going forward with this project?
Honestly, I just had one thing in mind, and that's getting Joseph's story out there to anyone who will listen, and like putting pressure on Bloomington Police Department. And I guess I didn't really think about how it would affect me. But I don't think that I've had too many instances where it's been negative. I know like initially when I started putting things out, there was like a short rumor that like I was somehow involved or something, because and it like I think it became from like the check thing, and like I don't know, somehow it spun out that direction. And that was kind of, it was terrible to think that. But I just and I remember like seeing that in like the comments, but people were really quick to be like, obviously she's doing all this to find her brother. She's not gonna whatever. But it's just like that there are always negative things that come up, when you're putting yourself out there. People might say negative things about Joseph, or they might, discredit him based off of like one fact, or whatever that looks like. So it's just, it definitely can be hard at sometimes, but I guess the cost of not doing it means that I don't find the answers. Out of everything, I feel like it hasn't been awful at all. Like I've been fine with going through the process and in the interviews and everything like that. It definitely has gotten a little bit more difficult now that I have a 1.5-year-old. So that's hard. And of course I'm, getting more into my career, but like, this is still such a priority for me because I've already put a lot of work into it, number one. And number two, it's like, if I don't, then who will? And of course, like Stacy is doing an amazing job as well. But just in general, like, I feel like it stops with me, as far as like who's going to be the most passionate and who's going to, love Joseph's for who he is, and, and know his story and understand it. And it's just like, now that I do have people like Stacy and other people who are starting to take that case and run with it, that's amazing. And, I just want to continue to push forward and be involved too. So
Has making and listening to these podcasts interacted at all with your grieving process?
I mean, yes and no. I feel like I feel better when I'm active and I'm doing something that's moving Joseph's case along. I feel worse when there's no movement. And so like, I mean, there is that pressure too, when you have a big following, that you don't want to let other people down too. But I also just don't want to let myself down, and I don't want to let Joseph down. And so I think that like, just like being able to do that actually gives me more energy to do more, and I guess also hold me accountable in a way too, I feel like. But like the grieving process for me, I feel like didn't really happen until maybe a year or two. I just feel like I was just going so hard at this, and I didn't really get like time to grieve, because immediately, like once Joseph's body was found, I had to go to the police department. I was in Bloomington, looking for him. So like they called me, I went there, and then, the next thing is, okay, we've got to get a press release together, and so like I didn't even have a chance to do that. And then like we were worried too how involved the media was going to be. So I didn't even go home. I stayed at like my in-laws house, and then literally got up that morning and went to an attorney who lived in like, I don't know, somewhere close to Bloomington. So I was an hour away. So we're getting up early. We're going there. We're getting, the attorney and the team together, and we're talking about the press release. We're talking about the memorial service. And then I had, the memorial service, and I had all these different things going on where I had to focus on, and then now you've got family members you haven't talked to in a long time that are coming in and, wanting to be a part of things and wanting to have control and wanting to, so it's just, I didn't really have time to like think or process in that moment. And, then you've got all the interviews and the things like that. So I think it just became like, again, I just kind of compartmentalized how I was feeling and just push forward, because at that time it really was just me. And the team of people that were willing to help me as well. But like, my father didn't get involved until he saw it on the news. So that just shows like the amount of time before, anyone else that was related to him was able to actually start. And of course, my little sister now is heavily involved, but she was really young then. So it was just me. So that's why I didn't really process it. And I still feel like now, now that I've had a chance to like settle down and process things, I have kind of went through that healing. But of course it's, it still pops up, like his anniversary is next week. So it's always like a milestone for me, like how far have I moved this case along? How close are we getting to answers? And then you've got like the time of the distance between when it happened, that like as the gap grows, you're losing precious information, you're losing memory of losing details. So it's a lot, but yeah, that's pretty much how my grieving's been.
For people that are out there who have unsolved cases, what kind of thoughts would you want to share with them? There are people who would like to create on lots of different platforms, podcasts, YouTube, TikTok, Reddit pages. What can you share with them from your experience?
So you mean from like the people, families that are wanting to? I would say like number one is like staying organized, like just making sure that you keep track of everything. Like you never know what will end up being a big piece later. And I ended up going through a divorce, so like I lost a lot of Joseph's items leaving that situation. So that was really sad. But like I have a drive where like everything is stored, that way you're able to pull from that information whenever you need it. And when opportunities do come along, where someone wants to help, you're able to provide information quickly. And then on top of that, just staying in front of, social media and trying to post as much as you can, talking to anyone who will listen, basically. I mean, that's been my strategy anyway. I'm not really sure where it goes from here, but yeah, like I think organization is the biggest key to getting things reopened. And yeah, pictures, like everything and anything that you have, just whether that's physical evidence or like digital, keeping it together.
As a family member, if you could say some things to general true crime media creators, what would you say?
Well, first, I appreciate all of them. I mean, like true crime, it's kind of strange because it's like, in a way, a lot of places are using your information as a form of entertainment, which is not the best like way to look at it, but it is kind of in a way. And there's a lot of people who are attracted to that. But the fact that there's a medium for this and there's like so much interest in like true crime in general is the only reason why I feel like we've gotten as far as we have. So I would probably say thank you for everyone who continues to bring these cases to light, because without you guys, it would be a lot harder. I mean, you'd have to rely on, if this was like the 90s, have to rely on the TV shows to try to find you, or an investigative journalist who could listen to you. And so to have all these different platforms and resources and media like options between like podcasts and shows and YouTube and TikTok, and like there's just so much out there. Like the fact that these creators have created a space for that, and the people are gravitating towards it, is huge. So I would say keep doing what you're doing, and I would keep looking for those, like what you guys do, looking for those cases that are unheard of, because everyone has a story and there are so many out there. And it's just like, how do you even just begin to choose? And mine could be no different from someone else who, lives in a different state. I'd say the only difference is that I'm just putting myself out there. And so you just have to, I guess, be open to that, but it might be worth it. I would say to keep asking questions. And that's the biggest thing, asking questions, and then, sharing Joseph's story, telling everyone you know about it until it reaches someone who could do more, whether that's, someone who may know, maybe there's a friend of a friend that knows Joseph's roommate and they're able to talk to them, or maybe, someone was on campus, and like I have had a lot of people reach out to me that are friends of friends. And so like Stacy said, every single detail matters, no matter if you think it's small or large. Like it could make a huge difference. It could change the timeline that we have so far for Joseph. It could change, the relationships that we already kind of like assume are the way they are. Like there's different pieces of information that could be super, super helpful. And so if you have any information, that could help, or even if you don't think it's help, but maybe you just have information, like I would reach out, to me or Stacy or whoever you can that can help.
To hear Joseph's story and more about Stacy and Vivianne's investigation, please download and listen to A Heavy Weight. We highly recommend this podcast. It is wonderfully and sensitively made and contains much more information about Joseph's case than we covered in this episode. You can find it wherever you get podcasts. We have also linked the Heavyweight email in our show notes. If you have any information concerning Joseph's case, please get in touch. We also encourage you to take a few moments to sign Vivianne's petition. You'll find its link in our show notes as well. If you know of a case that should be covered on the Fall Line, there's a link to our case submission form in the show notes. Thank you for listening. The Fall Line is an independently produced show, and we appreciate listener support. It allows us to do research, obtain FOIA, pay our content advisors, and support and donate to the causes we care about. If you try out the products we advertise, please use our sponsor codes. It really helps. And if you'd like to support the show and the stories we cover, join us on Patreon. We're raising Patreon funds to continue to pay for the Millbrook Twins billboard and to fund therapy for families who've been on the show. Each and every one of our patrons helps us to continue this work, and we're so grateful for your help. On Patreon, you can get early release ad-free versions of our regular episodes for $5 a month. We also have occasional video live streams and blogs, which all patrons can enjoy starting at $1. If you prefer Apple Premium, we've begun that feed as well, so you have an alternative way to contribute. You can sign up now in the app, and you'll begin receiving ad-free and early episodes of the podcast. Our portion of the proceeds will go to the therapy fund. The Fall Line is written, hosted, and researched by Laura Norton, with additional research by Brian Waters, Kiana Burgess, and Michaela Morrow. Interviews by Brooke Hargrove. Produced, engineered, and scored by Maura Curry. Content advisement by Brandy C. Williams, Liv Fallon, and Vic Kennedy. And as always, our most special thanks to Angie Dodd, Liz Lipka, and Sarah Turney.